The whole history of Russian feminism, from its foundation of the first women's organizations to the present, is difficult to put forth in a short paper. That's why today I would invite you to contemplate in general the difficult and contradictory social, economic, intellectual factors which influenced women's movement in Russia during 2 centuries. Background of the Russian feminism takes its roots in the 18th century, when the Russian society found itself under the influence of the Great French Revolution. The most progressive representatives of the Russian society followed the events in France, where the overall demand for doing away with despotism was joined by the voice of women. Among the rulers of Russia in the 18th century, 5 were women, 1 regent, and 4 rulers. Catherine the Great may be regarded as a model governmental activist, adroit, proficient, and successful. Catherine Dashkova towers among the figures of the 18th century Enlightenment, a finely educated woman who spoke 14 languages. She became the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences and Academy of Arts. Catherine the Great and Catherine Dashkova certainly was exceptional. But also the literary horizon witnessed appearance of women writers and poets, together with women's literature and female autobiographies. It signified the birth of social female self-consciousness. You may ask, if the position of women was so good at that time, where did the woman question come from? The answer lies in the definition of equality. How could equality between men and women be manifested in society? Does societal welfare actually demand equality? These and similar questions arose through Europe in the late 18th century. In early 19th century Russia, the woman question arose primarily as a move to improve women's social and familial position. Women's active participation in politics developed under this rubric. The first political organization for women, the Женское патриотическое общество, the Women's Patriotic Society, was formed in 1812 during the Patriotic War with Napoleon. The building of this Женское патриотическое общество, you can see it's in St. Petersburg. It was called later the first women's organization meant to achieve social goals. The women's movement continued with female participation in decembrist societies, which staged an abortive attempt to establish constitutional government in Russia in 1825. The decembrists, who believed in democracy, held that women should be full and equal participants in a democratic society. Women decembrists, the wives and sisters of those arrested and sent to exile in Siberia, took the lead in educational and benevolent work. It was an important step towards the development of equal participation in public life. Some women even attempted carrying literary works on politics and philosophy to Moscow and Petersburg and arranging their distribution there. These women did a lot to encourage the sense of togetherness of people in Siberian exile. They set up public libraries, medical health facilities, organized lectures and concerts. By living their life, they created a model of non-family public initiative. The example was shared by some of female writers of the early 19th century. Defending the ideas of female equality, they followed their own difficult path of self-discovery and self-determination. Talking about their disagreements with the stereotypes of the norms, they spoke against all state principle of good intentions. The crystallization of female collective self-consciousness in Russia was fostered not just of the women who fit well in the social and cultural context of the times, but the ones who fell out. The best poet of the 19th century, Alexander Pushkin, called them the lawless comets in the clear circle of planets. Those who blew out traditional stereotypes, who caused scandals by how they acted, contribute to the cause of the liberation of the individual by breaking the old moral criteria, by forcing to reconsider the old ideas. Some of lawless comets were well-educated persons. They supported the ideas of modernizing Russian autocratic system and wished to take part in discussing such issues. Their disputes tightly knit into high society flirtations presented a way of introducing provincial and urban women to public life. The Crimean War, middle of the 19th century, proved to be quite significant in fostering Russian women's search for ways and means to apply themselves outside of the family. It was during that war that Russian public health service was established. Women played an important role in it as female nurses. Their activity personified the root of women's self-emancipation. In the early 1850s, progressively minded Russian intellectuals, intelligentsia, became quite competent with the Western debate on women's equality. As a result of it, a number of works were produced by liberal Russian professors. There are some world-renowned scientists, psychologist Ilya Sechenov, historian Timofey Granovsky, outstanding surgeon Nikolai Pirogov, whose unpublished work, An Ideal of Women, was distributed in handwritten form, being read over and over again. But glory and reputation of someone who actually raised the women's issue in Russia belongs to criticist and man Mikhail Mikhailov, one of the contributors for the magazine Contemporary. In 1852, he wrote an essay, Women, Their Upbringing and the Role in Family and Society, which voiced the demand for women's equality in social and political life. Thanks to this article, women's issue gained its civic right in literature, and from that time on was perceived not as a separate problem, but as one of the manifestations of social ills. Many issues related to the emancipation of women in general attracted attention in the mid-19th century. Women's liberation became one of the most hotly debated issues in fiction and literary criticism, the only genres which could escape the strict governmental censorship. The beginning of women's movement in Russia, 1859-1904, was related to efforts to provide women with opportunities for professional occupations and economic independence. Secondly, it was connected to struggle for access to higher education. The first stage of Russian women's movement covers the period from 1859 to 1905, the second part of the 19th century. In 1859, three women, Maria Trubnikova, Anna Filosofova, and Nadezhda Stasova, came up with an idea to create a society for delivering inexpensive apartments in St. Petersburg, in the capital. At the early stage of existence of this feminist triumvirate, these women, together with other supporters, carried out a broad range of philanthropic and educational activities. Inspired by the ideas of enlightenment, Russian intelligentsia of different ranks tried to present the right to education as the starting point of any emancipation, including that of women. However, the access to higher education remained the critical issue. Young women found their way into universities to attend lectures, form their own sessions during which lectures on medicine and science were read aloud. Some of women activists achieved the opening of private, not state, women courses. In 1867, Maria Trubnikova, Nadezhda Stasova, and 100 of other noble women signed a petition addressed to the Dean of St. Petersburg University to allow women to attend lectures. At the same time, a petition to the First Congress of Russian Scientists was submitted. They asked to support the idea of establishing higher educational course for women. Both the Dean and the Congress expressed their sympathy with women, but they did not support the initiative. During the following 3 years, the same group of activists developed more and more appeals, and not without success. In 1870, Vladimir courses were set in St. Petersburg. In 1872, courses at the Military Medical Academy was opened up in St. Petersburg. But if they wanted to complete their education, Russian women had to travel abroad, first and foremost to Germany and Swiss. In these European universities, Russian female students were in constant contact with the ideas of Western feminism. These ideas were exported to Russia by these very women who later on helped to set up underground political groups. Russian and Western feminism had a lot of common. Financially secure women from the big cities' capitals were the ones who initiated women's movement in Russia. These well-to-do representatives of the educated society voluntarily donated their funds to public needs. The social composition of women's movement in Russia gradually changed from more well-to-do to the power. The age composition also. One could see at that time young ladies dreaming to get rid of parental guardianship and the yoke of the family. Striving to civil and political rights to be granted to them, the first Russian feminists viewed educational and free choice of occupation as means to obtain all these rights. Despite many similarities, the origins of Russian feminism had its own specifics. First of all, the juridical status of Russian women in regard to property and inheritance surpassed that of most women in Europe. Wives in all social classes had rights to property, specifically 1/14 of the husband's real property and 1/7 of movables. Daughters also had the right to a fixed percentage of the inheritance. Among other European women, such rights were either limited or non-existent. That's why in Russia, main debates were going on around the right to divorce and keep separate living arrangements with husbands, not about property. Second, significant property rights of Russian women made it possible for them to donate money and decide independently what to spend their riches on. Female entrepreneurship originated in Russia in the second half of the 19th century. Western feminists attempted to separate themselves from the male hierarchy and create their own system, free autocracy and hierarchies. Russian women's activists did not position themselves against men. They planned to use existing social structures of movements established by men to achieve their goals. Russian women who joined the feminist movement could not raise the issue about women's political rights because in autocratic Russia, many social groups had no political rights. In that regard, women were socially equal to men. Prohibition of women's organization in 1880s, during the times of especially political reactionary rule in Russia, became a measure that affected other public organizations as well. There is no way for Russian feminist movement to become a mass one in the 19th and even in early 20th century, before the first Russian Revolution, 1905. Russian feminists had no representatives in such state structures and organizations, and hence no opportunities to lobby and exert constant pressure over the authorities. Close link between literature, public, and real life was another characteristic feature of Russian social movements. Feminism was no exception. Right after the novel of Nikolai Chernyshevsky, What is to be Done, was published, Women's Labor Association and communists started to appear. Personal and family conflicts were now resolved in the manner similar and to that of the novel's characters. Russian feminists paid less attention to the issues of sexes and sexualities than their Western counterparts. Seventh, most early Russian feminists were good with pen, both prose and poetry. Maria Tseblikova, Yelena Conradi. In Ukraine, the feminist movement of the second part of the 19th century was represented exclusively by female writers. It's the vast idolization of women as embodiment of femininity was incomparably more pronounced than in Russia. Russian feminists viewed the cult of womanhood as a spiritual ghetto, as silk snares that continued to keep women in their usual roles, those of seducers, wives, and housewives. Therefore, in Russia, women's liberation was perceived as freedom of stereotypical social roles and professional self-realization, the theme that appeared in Western feminist movement only in 1960s. The charitable aspect of Russian women's movement was also different from the West. Женское дело, Women's Matter magazine, established in 1900, proclaimed that the most expedient, the only rational form of charity should come in the form of providing assistance with jobs and not free aid. 10th, links between feminism and revolutionary democratic movements was also characteristic of Russia. Extreme leftist movements in Russia showed great interest in the women question. They recognized that their successes or failure could lie in the support of women who formed half of the population and suffered from several disabilities. Some of Western researchers, Richard Stites for example, draws a parallel between the political terrorist movements of the 1870s and 1880s with women striving to become equal. Even though Soviet historians deny this connection, it was there. We can agree that women in 1860s, шестидесятницы, were first and foremost not revolutionaries, but the creators of semi-legal enterprises. However, they introduced others to the movement for liberation. Women active in 1870s, семидесятницы, had become already connected with the radical branch of Russian liberation. 1/5 of members of the radical organization Land and Freedom were women. In 1880s and even later, when Russian liberal feminism and Marxism had parted ways, the ideals of liberal interpretation of women's emancipation were upheld by Елена Чебышева-Дмитриева, Anna Shabanova, Ariadna Tarkova. Thanks to them, a number of women magazines were now being published in Russia. Женское дело, Women's Matter, Женская гигиена, Women's Hygiene, Женский вестник, Women's Herald, and so on. Established at the end of the 19th century, they were shut down by the Bolsheviks in 1918. Russian women's movement, so we can see this. Women's Equality Union. Russian women's movement of 1905-1970 was well prepared, both ideologically and organizationally. The revolutionary wave of 1905 summoned women who had been previously only demanding higher education and professional work to struggle for civil and political rights. In January 1905, about 30 women from St. Petersburg announced the creation of All-Russian Women's Equality Union, Союз равноправия женщин, which existed until 1908. In April 1905, it carried out the first to the Russian history reunion in defense of women's political rights. In May 1905, during the first Congress of the Union, the delegates discussed their ideological platform and goals. Immediate summoning of Constituent Assembly on the basis of universal, anonymous, and direct suffrage with no difference as what concerns sex, faith, nationality. Recognition of rights of different ethnic groups in Russia, equality of women of all social strata with men in political and civil rights in all spheres of life, access for women to all areas of social and professional activity, co-education, abolition of prostitution laws that were humiliating to women's dignity. In 1907, a similar Society for Common Aid was founded in St. Petersburg. An active role in its future actions played well-known Russian feminist Alexandra Kollontai. Society for Common Aid operated as the workers' club and brought together more than 300 people, both women and men, who shared the idea of women's equality. It is not accidental that the Bolsheviks devoted great attention to the women's movement. With some justification, Vladimir Lenin suggested that without the participation of an enormous number of working women, the social revolution could not take place. In the meantime, Women's Equality Union was trying to propagate the idea of granting women equal rights to vote, and during 1906-1907 struggle for equality in political sphere, the Legal Commission of Women's Equality Union perfectly studied the existing civil laws to identify the articles that were restricting women's rights. It tried to use Professor Petrozhitsky, member of one of the Duma committees, as a contact person to raise the issue of allowing women to vote. Women Progressive Party, established in 1907, led by Maria Pokrovskaya, editor-in-chief of Zhensky Vestnik magazine, also attempted to draw public attention to the problem of women's suffrage. The biggest event in the history of Russian women's movement was the summoning of the first All-Russian Women's Congress on December 1908. More than 1,000 participants took part in it. The permission to hold the Congress was obtained in 1906, but it took 6 years to get ready. Russian feminists who got together at the Congress viewed, as it was said during the plenary sitting, charity, mutual support, aid in work matters and education as their goals. However, the representatives of proletarian women's movement, led by Alexandra Kollontai, spoke against such unification. Alexandra Kollontai referred to the liberals as bourgeois feminists. She asked women not to be led by the charitable dames. Kollontai and her followers supported egalitarian interpretation of feminist tasks, so-called equality feminism, insisted on recognition of women as subject of law. Liberal feminists Anna Shabanova and Ariadna Terkova shared the concept of so-called feminism of differences. They argued that all women share universal social experience, women should not be compared to men, their difference should be recognized, and women should have the right to be different. A number of activists, Olga Klirikova, Sofia Spalatova, Olga Shapir, thought that universal equality was only a manifestation of inequality. Only equality with difference, as was said by Olga Shapir, was the basis for complete and harmonious relation between sexes. The issues of all citizens of the country, men and women alike, being responsible for the fate of Russia and its development along the democratic route, was also discussed at the Congress. Women's Equality Union, numbered at this time 8,000 members, ceased its existence after the Congress. Its functions were now executed by Russian League of Women Equality, Российская лига равноправия женщин, which by 1914 had its local branches in more than 50 cities and towns across Russia. In 1910, the activists of League Равноправки, Равноправны Equal in Rights, took part in the work of the first All-Russian Congress on fighting against pregnant women. In 1911, they went to Stockholm to attend the International Women's Congress. After that, they managed to make the Duma to consider legislation, first of all, allowing women to participate in local elections, even without the right to be elected. In 1916, Moscow Department of Russian League of Women's Equality, headed by Anna Shabanova, proposed a meeting to discuss creating of all Russian women's union. Many feminist organizations supported the idea. In March 1917, when the Second Russian Bourgeois Democratic Revolution forced Russian autocracy to collapse, the League members decided to continue their struggle. On March 19, 1917, more than 40,000 women came to take part in a demonstration in front of temporary government residence in St. Petersburg. Their streamers and slogans read, "Women's place is in the assembly," "Suffrage to women," "Women unite," "Women workers are demanding their rights to vote," "A right to vote cannot be universal without women." Not being satisfied with assurances made by Nikolai Chkhiidze, the chairman of the Council of Workers, and Mikhail Rodzianko, the chairman of State of Duma, to support women's struggles for their rights, the demonstrators promised not to leave until they received the insurance arrangements from Prince Grigory Lvov, the chairman of the Councils of Ministers. He turned out to be one to take responsibility to confirm universal suffrage as the right for both sexes. On March 21st, Grigory Lvov met with the delegates of the League, Vera Figner, Ariadna Turkova, Anna Shabanova, and Sofia Panina, and again confirmed on behalf of the government its intentions to exercise women's political equality. In August 1917, during elections to state and local dumas, the Party of Constitutional Democrats was the one that promoted most candidates, 12%, Bolsheviks had 10%, and Socialist Revolutionaries 7%. Women's League leaders had to admit that this result was only formally a success. Up to the October events 1917, both political parties and broad electorate were not ready to recognize women's right to participate in administration of the state. The Conference on Women Workers of Petrograd region in November 1970 was the last forum that Russian feminists participated in an all-official level. Alexandra Klanta, who attended the event, asked the participants to listen to representative of Russian League of Women's Equality, Dr. Dorashevskaya, so that women's workers would know who is their enemy now. That's what followed by Dorashevskaya arguing that men cannot defend women's interests since they don't understand them. However, this statement drowned with the din of disagreement, which signified the end of liberal Russian feminists of the first wave. Bolshevik decrees of late 1917, early 1918 prohibited the work of all feminist organizations, together with the activity of other parties and unions, except Bolshevik Party. The period from October 1970 to the early 1930 can be called the Great Experiment. The first Soviet decrees promised a lot to women. The new Soviet Constitution of 1918 immediately granted women equal rights under the law. Actual equality proved to be more difficult to attain. In political realm, equality meant most of all communist education of women, bringing them into the rank of party members and ultimately investing them in government positions. Lenin's comment on the subject became a virtual aphorism in the USSR. Even a kitchen maid can lead the government, and therefore it's necessary to involve women in politics. In order to involve women in political activity, Lenin directed that every party organization establish women's sections, zhenodeli, that even in October 1919, when the civil war was still in progress, The Zhenadele constitute a special governmental and party apparatus for work with women. The main goal of the Zhenadele was to retrain ideologically human resources, that is, to inculcate in women communist ideas. The Bolsheviks did not have evil intentions in this regard. On the contrary, they believed that resistance to communist ideas sprang from ignorance. A characteristic slogan of the period read, "With an iron hand, we will drive humanity to happiness." While the party sponsored its own organizations for women, it harshly condemned any other non-party women's groups. In order to achieve equality between men and women in the family, the Bolsheviks introduced a whole range of important and innovative reforms. One of these reforms, enacted in December 1970, was the Decree of Civil Marriage, which replaced ecclesiastical control over marriage with governmental oversight. Decrees protected women and children during pregnancy and nursing, mandated maternity leave. For the first time in Europe, women could keep their maiden name. Another first time, in 1920, was realized feminist demand to regulate reproductive rights by recognizing women's rights for abortion. However, this legislation norms never resulted in equal opportunities with men. The state gradually took upon itself the paternalistic role of a father and a patriarch. That was metaphorically expressed by the activists of women's movement in 1920s, Ines Armand, Nadezhda Krupskaya, Sofia Smidovich, who tried to assure the mothers that the socialist state would always support them regardless of marital bonds. Motherhood was defended as social responsibility, which was supposed to supplement women's responsibility to work on equal terms with men. Even before 1917, a significant number of women workers worked in factories. After the revolution, rapid industrialization demanded enormous quantities of workers, and women answered the call to build socialism. Until 1921, those who did not work, did not eat, did not receive ration cards. In the 1920s, the number of women factory workers exceeded the number of men. These attitudes referred to the solution of women's issue, in reality, did not liberate women, having simply made their lives more difficult. However, this aspect was not admitted during public debates at that time. How did women react to all these new laws and attitudes after the Russian Revolution? Women's reactions varied. Some educated women were inspired by the grand transformation of society and believed that anything was possible. Others regarded the situation pessimistically, believing that all the efforts would yield little. Women workers who entered unions and party and state organizations felt themselves a part of the process of building a new society. They readily sacrificed their free time, health, energy, and happiness for the sake of the promised future. By 1930s, the situation had reacted a critical point, and family policy witnessed a traditionalist backlash. The consolidation of Stalin's rule in 1930s was marked by a reversal in women's fortunes. Because Russia had no tradition of bourgeois democracy, it found itself once again under autocracy, that time under Bolshevik party. It is not surprising that the Soviet Union of 1930s resurrected the ecclesiastically based ideas of pre-revolutionary period. Discussion of sex disappeared from the page of magazines. Sexuality turned up to be closely linked to reproductive behavior. In 1935, USSR stopped producing contraceptives. Women who somehow managed to obtain condoms washed and reused them. Despite these new restrictions on women's autonomy, women were still expected to participate equally with men in work in factories and collective farms. In accordance with Lenin's dictum to bring women into the workplace, women were recruited for labor even in hazard industries such as mining, metallurgy, and chemical manufacture. In 1931, 43,000 women worked in mines. Traditional functions of division of labor had successfully come back to life. Under conditions of constant deficit of consumer goods, these functions were fully mobilized both before and after the World War II. During the World War II, Russian women began to work in spheres that had been mostly or exclusively intended for men, managers of factory shops or directors of enterprises. These changes seemed to go unnoticed by the state, which saw women only as mothers and workers. After the end of war, women became easily driven of their forced positions as leaders due to the growth of men's symbolic value. The Soviet press began to argue women to bear 10 or 12 children and to turn over child rearing to public daycare. To be honest, the cost of daycare was minimal, and most women could afford to send their children. In 1955, a new law once again legalized abortion for the purpose of preventing illegal ones. But the continuing lack of alternative forms of contraception meant that abortion became the major method of birth control. Even today, Russia leads the world in the number of abortions. From 1950s to the 1980s and more, abortions are performed without anesthesia and are a punishing procedure for women. Authorities feared making abortion too painless, lest women seek them more often. Abortions were no longer considered criminal offense. Women and their families regained control over fertility. However, this policy was not supported by sex education. There were no public or media debates on the matter of sex and sexuality till mid-1980s. During the period of Khrushchev thaw and de-Stalinization, women again became aware of their unequal equality. Women shared with men an equal burden of work outside the home and also had the burden of being wives, mothers, and housekeepers. The official party goal of this period was to achieve the harmonious combination of motherhood with a more active participation of women in the labor force. However, nobody knew how to achieve it. The era of economic stagnation that followed were marked by doubts in viewing some social issues as fully resolved. Women's issue was one of them. The Soviet state no longer exercised strict regulation of women's lives or attitudes and life goals. That was the time of mass housing, construction, partial rehabilitation of private life, increased autonomy of the family. Women were granted paid maternity leave, a month and a half before the birth of a child and a month and a half afterwards. Women had the right to work part-time and flexible hours. Women with young children received 3 extra days of vacation time. In 1967, fixed child support was introduced, 25% of the salary earned by the spouse who left the family. The Code on Marriage of 1968 stipulated welfare benefits for single mothers. The ideology continued to be persisted in treating correct femininity as identical to motherhood. The status of working mother was proclaimed as an achievable ideal. It was supported by the resilience of patriarchal attitudes to the upbringing of girls as those responsible to serve men at home and take care of their health. By late 1970s, it had become clear that combining the roles of a working woman and a mother was quite complicated. It was now believed that women had become overly masculinized. To overcome this problem, women were supposed to return back to the family. The Committee of Soviet Women was the only women's organization allowed to function. It was nothing more than a marionette in the hands of the ideological department of the Communist Party Central Committee. By early 1980s, there were about 20% of women among the party members. However, the leading ranks only numbered 2%, and there was not a single woman in the Central Committee itself. The USSR witnessed the rebirth of feminism as a reaction to the Soviet emancipation. Some women from large cities became involved in the human rights movement. They were mostly engaged in basic draft and not leading work, as typists, as proofreaders, as binders. The characteristic feature of Soviet women's dissidents, Natalia, Lydia Alexeyeva, and others, was a combination of radical views, a rational approach to carrying out tasks, and deep conviction of the rightfulness of their cause. Since their male colleagues proved to be reluctant to publish materials on women's issues in the most influential of some self-publishing journals, a group of Leningrad human rights advocates, Natalia Malakhovskaya, Tatiana Goricheva, Tatiana Mamonova, and Yulia Voznesenskaya, decided to seize the initiative to uncrown the myth of problemless women's fate in the USSR. In the 1979, they created an almanac, Women and Russia, which was being arrested by the KGB right on its way out. Елена Daron, Tatiana Mikhailova, Ksenia Romanova, Svetlana Sokolova joined the group somewhat later when the issues of publishing a regular magazine, Maria, has been raised. Similar to Russian feminists of the first wave, these feminists did not view their movement as anti-male one, and together with the liberals of the 20th century, denied equality feminism and argued for feminism of differences, the development of women in all the beauty and fullness of its gender. The specific feature of Russian feminism of that time, re-established in illegal basis, was its close connection to Russian Orthodox Church. The feminists viewed Mother Mary as their symbol, and was their reaction to the equality of sexless slaves that protest against atheist ideological system. The reforms of mid-1980s changed women's position in the Russian society. They created conditions for new forms of women's movement, the emergence of many public associations. They began to struggle not for not just formal and legal gender equality, but the real one. The absolute majority of the new and existing organizations that upheld the interests of women preferred to be called precisely women's. That time, the term feminism and its derivatives were associated with in public consciousness with something negative, politicized, ideological, brought from the West and unnecessary for Russia. This was an artifact from Soviet past, during which the struggle for women's rights, separate from broader struggle of the proletariat, was considered bourgeois and thus pointless. The first women's groups, calling themselves independent, started to appear already in 1980s. They were the ones who openly cast doubt on the experience of resolving the women's question in the USSR, showing that it is not resolved, that women even formally did not enjoy equal rights with men, and there was no real equality to be spoken of all over it. The second stage, from 1993 to 1995, these organizations began to seek ways to cooperate with government authorities of the party political system and ran into stereotypes about the role and place of women in society. The number of organizations rose middle of the 1990s to 300. It was at that stage that the task appeared of gender education of society, spreading knowledge about human rights and women's rights in the context of unrealized human rights. The main event of this period was the victory of Women in Russia movement in the State Duma elections of 1993, with 8% of the vote. As a result of this, the first women's parliamentary faction in the Russian history was formed, headed by Ekaterina Lakhova. Despite the fact that the faction was quite effective in general conservatism of the general conservatism of the political culture of Russians prevented them from winning the elections after 1995. But the activeness of women in 1993 to 1995 left its mark on political life. Parties began to include far more women for their lists. In recent years, the women's movement, and specifically its feminist manifestations, have entered a serious crisis. In 1990s, at the end of 1990s, the majority of feminist groups existed in an atmosphere of general political liberalism and operated with the support of Western organizations. However, the situation changed drastically in 20s due to Vladimir Putin's and the United Russia Party's rise to power. Almost immediately thereafter, a political reversal occurred, associated with the outright rejection of liberalism and the devaluing of human rights. At the same time, Western sponsors calculated their work in Russia essentially was complete and consequently curtailed their problems. Being deprived of financial support and sensing the change in the social and political climate, many activist groups simply ceased to exist. As a result, no organized feminist movement operates on the territory of Russian Federation today. But a lot of women's organizations continue to exist at a grassroots level. They attempt to resolve practical issues that their members face daily, and often they receive state support, but pointedly distance themselves from traditional feminists and are far removed from the aims of the feminist agenda. So, you can see this, some of our groups, political groups. So we can see this Forum of Orthodox Women, and also the logo of Second All-Russian Women's Summit that was held in 2008. And there is no women activity at the liberal side. So you can see that convocation of the Second All-Russian Women's Congress in 2008 confirmed the existence and of a conscious divide within the Russian women's movement on this photo. On the one side, we would like to see the liberal-minded feminists leaning towards the West, but there are only few such groups, special sections or departments at the universities. On the other side, the conservative Russian Union of Orthodox Women. Between them were ordinary women earnestly trying to resolve the everyday and pressing problems of average Russian women. Established in 2009, the Committee for the Consolidation of Women's Movements in Russia to date has been unable to pacify these competing political actors. That is all that I would like to tell you. So, I think that you have now a picture of the history of all our women organizations and of our women movement, not always really feminist movement, but women movement in Russia. And I am a head of Russian Association for Research in Women's History, and our association is also a part of this council. I have told on the last page, this Committee for the Consolidation of Women's Movements in Russia. It exists from 207. So it is. Thanks for your attention.